Redirecting to the live streaming page. All right, let me just move some windows around. Let me pull up YouTube so we can see any comments that might be going on over there.
Got that pulled up.
Bear with us, folks. We're in
height. Height is how you say it.
Height. All right, thank you.
I just found a video. Cool website, Youglish, and it pulls up actual citations and YouTube videos marked to the point where they say it, so you can hear different pronunciations.
Cool. That's useful.
Nerdy.
That's useful. All right, now I got to find Ryan Olkey again. Where'd you go? There you are. Ryan Olkey, what's up, brother?
Hey, man, good to see you.
Good to see you.
You have the lovely background as always. Yeah. I don't know if you even continue improving it every single time, or
I slowly add things in over time until it's just like this total hoarding disaster behind me.
Eventually, it's just going to be your head encased in objects,
just like surrounded by geek paraphernalia. No, we've got a special guest today. I'd like to introduce Tom Servo.
I didn't know if that was new or not, but it's so you that I'm like, it could have already been there and I didn't notice.
Tom Servo, for those who don't know, is our guest from one of my favorite TV shows, Mystery Science Theater 3000.
It's awesome.
Yeah. I just like to load it up back here. We have fun.
I love your background. It's awesome.
Well, it's real good to see you, brother.
Good to see you too.
Yeah, man. I had a great dinner this week with our mutual homie, Vince Horn.
Yeah, nice.
He came into Colorado, and
that's awesome.
We got together. I made him some burgers.
Oh, I'm jealous.
It was awesome seeing him. I haven't, we play video games with him, fairly often, not often enough these days, but fairly often. But I haven't seen Vince like in the flesh.
In person,
I mean, I haven't seen you in the flesh in a really long time.
I know, it's been a long time.
It's been way too long. So that was a really nice reunion.
Awesome. Yeah. Jealous. I wish I could have been there.
Oh, I love that guy so much.
Likewise.
Well, we are here, I think, with yet another issue that, at least for me, feels very pressing, and this really syncs up with, as all of our shows do, you know what I mean? Like we do these shows and they sort of are incremental. All of our shows are sort of referring to themes that we've discussed in previous shows. And I think today is no different. What we're going to be talking about today is inhabit your speech. And this feels, again, just absolutely critical to me at this period as an integralist, looking out at the extreme fragmentation of the world that we live in, of our media institutions, our governing institutions, etc., and feeling how that fragmentation actually is reshaping our own psyches, my own psyche, and is sort of giving this broken mirror reflection of the reality around us. And I think even the best of us, even the smartest of us, the wisest of us, the most skillful of us can easily fall into some of the sort of traps that things like social media have laid out all around us. And I think, in fact, we probably see this almost every day. And I continue to have this feeling that, like, as integralists, if we can just find a way to name the problem, we can do a better job of rising to the occasion and overcoming it. And that's what I'm hoping conversations like this lead to, just within our own, sort of deep but narrow sphere of influence. So yeah, it's a conversation that feels important, and I'm looking forward to having with you.
Yeah, likewise. And you said do a better job. To me, this always goes back as a clear indicator that, do I want to do a better job, which means that I have to look at strategy, and that there's a strategy that I care about to bring about a change or transformation or whatever it might be. But if one is not concerned with doing a better job, then either one may not be quite really at the integral stage, or there's shadows to work with that are getting in the way of that. So to me, I mean, honestly, a lot of times the biggest thing is like, just acknowledge that. And that's my advice. Actually, I continue to love that you've called green pre-integral. And my core advice to pre-integral green is to focus on differentiating between strategy, values, and outcome. and to focus on strategy, because if you can acknowledge that your strategy is not working, you're forced to level up, but if
Yes.
you confuse all three, then you have no reason to say, how do I do that better? It's how do other people do it better, because I'm freaking great. I'm enlightened. So this is like underlying all that for me. So this is kind of an assumption that like we're ready to say like, yeah, no, I want to do this better. So let's get into this so we can get some clarification and see how we can communicate more
Yeah,
effectively.
totally. Yeah, totally. That's all super well said. And I think what a lot of this, for me again, what a lot of this amounts to is, we've heard Ken talk many times about sort of the four ups of integral. It's now been
Mhm.
expanded to like 5 or 6 ups.
Yeah, I know.
Let's stick with the four just to sort of, kind of keep
I got to up
ourselves
my ups.
all right, right? Grow up,
Yep.
clean up, wake up, show up,
Mhm.
right? So these are the four ups. And I think that this conversation is really, really emphasizing that final up, the showing up. In other words, we have done all of this work over the course of, years, sometimes decades, to grow up within our own interiors, right? To sort of to move through these unfolding stages of development at our own pace, of course. Sometimes some of us push a little harder on that line than others, but there's this gradual sort of upticking of consciousness that we experience throughout our lives. We become more mature, we become more responsible, we are better able to inhabit some of the later stages of development that reveal themselves to us in this growing up process.
Yeah.
And then we have the path of waking up, which again, many of us have been deeply committed to for years, in the guise of various spiritual practices, whether that be meditation or prayer or ecstatic dance or whatever it might be. We have a series of practices that is putting us into direct and immediate contact with universal goodness, beauty, truth, however you want to sort of convey that, whatever language works the best for you to describe those kinds of territories. The practice of waking up helps confirm that A, those territories are real, B, they are an essential part of you and of me and of the we that exists between the two of us. And it requires a lot of work. I mean, there's a little bit of sweat that goes into both growing up and waking up. And then, of course, we have cleaning up, the process of doing shadow work and recovering these sort of fragmented, splintered pieces of ourselves that we may have left behind in previous stages of development, for example, or even pieces of ourselves that sort of get paved over in the waking up progress. There are certain kinds of shadows that are associated with states, and Ken Wilber has done an amazing job of sort of documenting these different kinds of dysfunction that can occur in either the growing up line or the waking up line. And it requires cleaning up work to do. Now, all of this, the growing up, the waking up, and the cleaning up is all taking place sort of in our own interiors. Some of it is taking place between us, right? Like there's an intersubjective kind of piece to this, but the sort of the locus, the real focus of the action when it comes to growing up, waking up, cleaning up is it's all taking place within our own subjective interior consciousness. And then we get to the last up, which is show up. And for me, this is like the tipping point, right? This is when all of that work that we've done in our interiors, the years, the decades of practice and cultivation of various skills and ways of enacting the world, all of this tips over and begins to spill out into these other quadrants. That's when we begin to notice how we relate with each other, the quality of our relationships, the quality of sort of the environments that we find ourselves in, how those environments are actually influencing and sometimes even directly shaping our own perceptions, our own relationships with each other, and our own behaviors in the world. All of this, I think, is part of this crucial showing up practice where we get to sort of, it's like these are the fruits of all the inner work that we've been doing. It's sort of the culmination in a certain kind of way. And it's not like these things happen in a sequence. It's, first you do your growing up. I mean, it's all, there's a simultaneity to all this. As we're growing up, we're also figuring out how to better show up,
Yeah.
etc. Which to me, I think shows how important, how critical, and how irreducible really all four of these different kinds of practices are in the relationship that they have with each other, and how it sort of calls us to, as we were just talking about, to do better, to be better, to, light a flame in the dark, to do whatever we can to sort of, I was just doing some writing a couple of days ago, and I was saying, I tend to live, I find that I often live in two worlds. One world is like the ideal, where I get to imagine, hey, what would it be like if we had, a population whose center of gravity was integral, and here's are the integral systems that we would create and what the world might look like. That's the ideal kind of science fiction integral world I like to live in. And then I also live in this real world with all of its challenges and pains and limitations, etc. And the reason I like to inhabit both worlds is so that I can dedicate my own life's work to trying to close the gap between them, right? Like, I know I'm probably not going to see the promised land in my lifetime, but damn it, I'm going to dedicate myself and my passions and my vocation to doing whatever I can to bringing those two worlds just a little bit closer together, so that, hey, maybe our kids will have a chance of seeing that world.
Yeah.
All of which is to say, I think that this conversation speaks directly to that process of learning how to show up more fully in a more fulfilling and satisfying way in the world, that, where we can actually exert a little bit more influence and maybe kind of nudge this, nudge the world kind of in the direction we'd like to see it going.
Yeah. Awesome overview. Thanks for setting us up.
I love my preambles.
No, they're great. I mean, it's awesome, man. You I can tell you know how to do this. So, one thing just to add, not much to add there in terms of prepping us here, but for showing up, typically, and I do this a lot too, is framing it as a result, fruition, because that makes sense. It's like the other ones have this sense of like practicing for something, and then showing up, we get to see like how all that's being integrated, right? And how that's transforming and changing how we show up. But I often do like to note that when we show up, it's like the greatest source material we have that then influences why to practice. Because without that, then that's sometimes where we can get the idealization gets too great. Because it's not connected. It's so, we're talking about inhabit your speech. So it's like, well, what happens when you inhabit your speech? Well, surely it's going to show like how practice has been helpful, but it's also going to show where the edges are, where really a lot of times it's not even, we talk a lot about practice of like identifying our edge, identifying what's missing, working with it, boom, boom. But it's just like you're in it and you're like, oh, here's what's not working. And it just neutrally, it's not, who cares even of labeling it growing up or cleaning up. It's just like, oh, here's something that's not working that well in my engagement or in our engagement in communication. Well, okay, I want to work on this. This is new source material to throw back in to all of the ups. So just throwing it out there as
No, it's beautiful because there's sort of there's a tension, as always, right? There's a tension in the polarity between sort of a perception of lack, for example, and a perception of abundance. And we can see how both lack and abundance really factor into, again, all of these paths. Right. I mean, oftentimes when we're growing up, when we want to do the work to grow up, it's because, not only because there's some idealized, sort of vision of who we can be in our minds, but there's also pain that we are pushing against, right? There's something that we're pushing away from in order to get us closer towards something else. And of course, every stage that we grow through brings with it more abundance. And of course, the spiritual practice is all about shifting from lack to abundance, right? A perception of shifting from a perception of separateness. And lack comes with separateness. I need something, I don't have it, I need to get it, right? And I feel this kind of palpable lack in my heart or in my gut or wherever you might feel it. And spiritual practice, I think, helps convert that sensation of lacking into a sensation of abundance. We can also talk about lack and abundance when it comes to the path of cleaning up. I don't want to dwell on it too much here, but I think when it comes to showing up, again, at least showing up at integral stages, I think is again, there's this tipping point from lack to abundance. Like we're showing up not not because we lack something, but because this has become so abundant in us that it spills out of our eyeballs, it spills out of our communications with each other. And, it's sort of that it takes our ongoing practice to that next level of being able to inhabit ourselves and our world and our relationships more integrally, more fully, more thoroughly. And again, it gives that abundance just a place to go as it spills out into our behaviors, into our systems, into our relationships and cultures, etc. So again, it feels like a natural sort of maturation of the integral mind, where eventually we have no choice but to show up more fully than we previously knew how to. And just to kind of get this conversation started, Ryan, this morning in my feed, sort of synchronistically, this Jonathan Haidt article came through, and man, I'm so excited about this article. First off, we were saying during pre-show, as an integral thinker, it's rare for us to feel our own biases being confirmed out there. Usually we see just these kind of little narrow biases up against these other little narrow biases, and there's so few people who are able to coherently and elegantly kind of put it all together. And I think that's exactly what Jonathan Haidt did in this article. And the article is called great title, Why the Past 10 Years of American Life Have Been Uniquely Stupid. It's not just a phase. A good clickbait title right there. Ironically, clickbait, of course, is one of the problems that Jonathan Haidt is pointing out in this article. But, I was thinking maybe in the beginning of the show, we can actually, I wrote down a sort of a list of bullet points of what was mentioned in this article. And it got me so excited because Jonathan Haidt is speaking directly to themes that I've been trying to varying degrees of success over the months and the years to kind of, put my finger on. And it feels almost like, Jonathan kind of stepped into, he inhabited my head and was able to express these things far more eloquently and with more authority than I've been able to. So this article really has me kind of turned on right now.
Cool. Yeah, that's great. I haven't got to read it, but it's definitely, since you just passed it to me not too long ago, but I'm looking forward to it. And even just your description of it points to something here and talking about inhabiting your speech. Like, for somebody to be able to write an articulate article like this that is truly engaging and meaningful requires inhabiting speech. It's in written form. And
100%.
I think I've been noticing slowly, it feels like it in the last year or so, articles or forms of media popping up like in the more organic, broader scope of culture, things like this, where it's starting to feel like integral, in a very natural way, which feels good, almost taking me by surprise a little bit, almost like, is this for real? Like, it's not just like more specialty or niche, like in the communities that we're a part of, where there's a lot of great discussion and works in there, but like to now be in big sources and networks, it's like, wow. Okay.
No, I feel the same way. Whenever you see an article like this and, it didn't come through an integral network, it didn't come from a guy who, I don't know if Jonathan's familiar even whatsoever with Ken's work. And it reinforces this idea that integral is not a brand, right? It's not even a theory. There is an integral brand. There is an integral theory. I've devoted my career to sort of, to both of those things. But integral is also a general stage, and people at this stage are going to make observations from this stage. And those observations are naturally going to align in really, really interesting ways, even if we don't, again,
that's really important to know, because
exactly,
this is like, if it truly is a stage, and it seems like it is, then it's inevitable. Like, if this is the inevitable progression of human evolution, at some point it's just going to be like everybody's integral. Right? We don't talk about like if majority of people's from rational level development, it's like we're not like who was the person who identified it first. We don't care. We're beyond that. That's like that's how it is. So eventually we have to let go and say, like, it doesn't matter where this person's coming from. It's like what they're producing very much embodies this. And that's what we want to see personally. That's what I
Yep.
want to see. It's just like where it's nobody I ever even heard of. They don't even know of Kin's work. And it's just because it means we're slowly transforming.
That's right. No, it does two things for me. It confirms for me, well, reinforces my own perception that the territory is real, right? Because more
Yes.
people are beginning to stake it out, right?
Yep.
Even if they have different maps than I do, they are staking out the same territories that
Mhm.
we've been looking at for, again, decades.
Yeah. Right.
It also confirms the map itself, because the map
Yeah.
has certain sort of predictive elements to it. Like the map predicts that a stage of development will not come online in a sort of full-throated way, right? It will not come online until the life conditions require it to.
Right.
And we've been saying how, like, guys, this is it.
We feel like we're in a very requiring.
We're living those life conditions right now.
Yeah.
Like we
That's
are.
the silver lining.
It really is. I mean, to me, it's, it reinforces this idea that I've been sort of repeating, that like, man, Ken Wilber, bless his heart, was like 30 years too
that's amazing.
soon.
Yeah.
And now that's part of the unfolding, because
Yeah.
Ken helped give us a foundation, right? So that now these life conditions are beginning to sort of drop down on our heads. We have sort of a robust network of people and perspectives and practices to draw upon to kind of put Humpty Dumpty back together.
Yeah, and the maps will be incredibly useful for navigating it. So like if there's a map like what Ken has produced is generally useful, it'll continue being useful as a template or as just something as a reference point, which happens a lot. There's developmental maps that are used in education for kids and things like that. So continues being relevant, but there is a difference between the map and then the organic expression of it. The culture.
Yep, totally. Well, cool. I want to summarize some of the points in this article. I mean, first off, I advise everyone watching right now to go read it for yourself. It's in excuse me, I need a little bit of water. It's in The Atlantic. I think it was published very recently, last few days. Fantastic article. But here's a basic kind of again, bullet point summary of what he's talking about in this article. And we can pause on any of these, Ryan, to
sounds good.
Sort of, discuss.
I was only hoping you were going to do a Mark Rubio with the water, a longer water drink, more frantic. Inhabit your speech. Sorry, Mark. I know you were thirsty.
When I edit this clip, I'm going to add like a little clip of Rubio doing that.
Yeah, you should totally Easter egg that in there.
So Jonathan Haidt begins this article, I think, with two metaphors that I think, again, feel fully aligned with a lot of the observations that I've been making, as well as sort of the entire kind of spirit of Integral itself. And the first one, he compares what we're going through right now to the parable of the Tower of Babel. The idea being that, in the original sort of biblical story, the people were fragmented by speaking multiple languages. Now, I know this is a problem you can appreciate, Ryan, as someone who speaks like, I don't know, you're like, you speak like 3 dead languages.
I'm a language nerd for sure.
For sure you are. In our case, Jonathan Haidt says we are fragmented because we are, quote, disoriented, unable to speak the same language or recognize the same truth. We are cut off from one another and from the past. This is, I think, a critical observation and is exacerbated, I think, by the fact that, I've observed several times that it seems like over the last 5 or 6 years, maybe a little bit longer, one of the biggest things that has changed in our own interiors is sort of the emergence of a political identity as being just primary, like the primary lens that we see ourselves through and that we see each other through. And the problem is that lens has become so opaque that we actually can't see each other through it any longer. We can barely see ourselves through it.
Yeah. So, and I might be asking you questions then, which will, since you've read the whole article. So, I assume that he probably gives, maybe it's the whole freaking article of like, what is he liken that to, or the causes of this? Is it like kind of like a cultural war, developmental thing? Or I don't know if he would even go that far. That would be amazing if that's pointing that out. But is that, what does he note as source of this disconnect? So for Babel, it was multiple languages, right?
Yes.
In
Yep.
literal languages.
Again, this is what reinforced the fact that I really think Haidt is a intrinsically integral thinker.
Yep.
He points to factors in every quadrant. He points to factors in every quadrant. So he points to technological factors, which we'll talk about in a second. He points to cultural sort of feedback loops that form out of those technological factors. He talks about even things like parenting, for example, how parenting has changed over the generations and how that contributes to the problems. And we'll see much of this when we actually get to his list of recommendations, which we will be adding to in this show. So yeah, he really does have again, I don't think he even is aware of the 4 quadrants as a heuristic, but he's intuitively using them.
It's really interesting. And so since I haven't read the article, I don't have the internal organization of bullet points in my head. So I know I may jump ahead back and forth,
totally fine. Yeah.
You can rein me in. But what comes up for me is, so we lack a point of unification, right? So that's what that's saying, it's a comparison to Tower of Babel. And in the past, I'm just mostly familiar with the US culture. Might have been country, a sort of sense of like, we are the United States. I actually also think like basic common decency kind of thing, which Joe Biden kind of represented, for even regardless of like, approval polls. There wasn't very many people who would be like, this guy's going to change everything. Right. But there was a sense of like a desperation for some of us to just be like, hey, like even that would feel okay, and like a common point, like, so that's been lost. Like how do we find some unification point? But then we have this thing of acknowledging the differentiation, and the pluralism in culture and solving these problems. So it's a really interesting point of like, where do we find the unification? And it seems like reflected, I'm sure he acknowledges all this, but we see it so much every day, like politically, it's just almost like a boring given, even though it's a catastrophe of just like, of course, we're not going to agree on anything, whatever. It's just every day. So it's interesting. So that brings up the question for me. And again, I want to emphasize, if we're like organically living this and like using showing up as saying like, I want to find out what's not working. Like with me, with us, not just like out there, like I got it all figured out, no, it's just like, well, what is it? So how do we get reoriented, right? I'm sure he's going to provide suggestions, like you said, but I like to put in the question and invite people listening too to like inhabit the question. Could be another episode.
You're the kind of guy who likes to read the last 3 pages of a book before you begin it. You're heading us off at the pass here. No, and it's great.
I figured I would. That's why I said I was going to rein me in.
I'm going to answer your question. I'm going to skip ahead just a few bullets, because Haidt actually looks at 3 factors that lead to the sort of breakdown of trust that we're seeing today. He calls them, let's see here, social capital, which means extensive social networks with high levels of trust. That's the first factor. Second factor is strong institutions. And the third factor is shared stories. Now, he doesn't necessarily specify the sort of the common factor, or what's uniting all of these shared stories. But I think it does get to something that you mentioned, which is a healthy and robust national identity, which is sort of the health, I like to regard as sort of a healthy conservatism within myself, and feels like the lesson that we might have learned or should have learned from the rise of Trump and sort of the jingoistic nationalistic language in his messaging that brought him, to his ascension. And I feel like that the reason why that nationalism, a broken nationalism, I would say, but it's a broken nationalism that emerged in a vacuum where healthy nationalism should be.
What was the second one, Corey?
The second one was strong institutions. We're talking governing institutions, media institutions, scientific institutions, economic institutions, all of which are anything but strong, at least the way we enact them today.
Yeah, great. That's awesome. And, it's a random thing that made me think of. It made me think of you because you pointed this stuff out before about messaging with the political parties, which is by extension something about like speech, right? It's a kind of standalone specific form. But I don't know if you saw the recent, like, I don't know what was it, a CPAC? I don't know, is that what it's called? CPAC Republican Convention? It looked like a Trump
There's there's AFPAC, which is sort of the
There was something that just happened like within a week, and it was just looked like a kind of more of a Trump fest. But I don't know. I saw a tagline with it. And here's the thing, like as an integral person, like be like, do I like the ideas in the community? Like, no, but I have to acknowledge a good tagline when I see it. And their tagline was awake, not woke. And I was like, oh, it's like, okay, on one
I
hand,
did it
like,
first. I did that first, guys.
did
I have
you?
a show with Mark Fischler called From Woke to Awake. So clearly CPAC
yeah.
is ripping us off here.
Dude, of course. And again,
No,
like
it's an
forget, I'm just
obvious-
like, in terms of messaging, I'm like, man, they keep doing great
They
with
do.
one-liners. It's like
100%.
for their community, it was like,
Yep.
that was a home run. I was like, oh man.
Yep. No,
Anyways,
it's true.
kind of
Conservatives
an aside,
are,
I know, because it would just made me think of like shared stories and things like that. I'm just like, whatever they may be, like I disapprove of. I'm like they get an A+ on taglines.
that is such an important point. Conservatives are better than progressives when it comes to these shared stories that they're able to communicate and that deeply resonate with their own base. Now, the problem is we see a diminishment, I think, of shared stories that unite sort of all these different ideologies, right? It used to be that our two parties were cast as loyal opposition. Well, we've lost the loyalty and we've amped up the opposition to the point now where both sides of the political divide believe they are the true patriotic Americans and therefore need to push the other set of people's ideas out of the country entirely, which is obviously not patriotism. We don't have that common sort of field that's uniting, again, all of these kind of warring ideologies and sort of delivering us to a common sense of similarity, a common sense of shared identity with each other, which again is the vacuum, I think, where a healthy nationalism should be. And this is the reason why we see this regression on both sides of the aisle, on the left and on the right, back towards this kind of hard amber that is now dissociated in many ways from the sorts of orange and green fruits of civilization that we've been able to enjoy for the last 100 years or so. Which it brings me to Jonathan Haidt's second major point here, which is, again, just a thoroughly integral point, especially to lead a discussion with. He says, there is a direction to history, and it is toward cooperation at larger scales. I am just a sucker for anyone with a good meta narrative. And that is the integral. There is a growth towards increasing cooperation. In the 20 tenets, Ken calls this a growth towards increasing differentiation and increasing integration. So at every stage, we have a wider variety of possible forms and roles and expressions, etc., which brings with it a higher capacity to integrate that multitude of roles and perspectives into a higher sort of social hold-on in this case. This is exactly what Jonathan Haidt is pointing to when he says there is a direction in history towards greater cooperation. However, there's it's not a straight line. It's a bumpy road. And right now we are experiencing one of these dips, which he believes, and I probably agree, is going to get worse before it gets better. For all these reasons that we'll continue to get into. He also mentions how let's see here, social media began to, and this is where he really starts seeing, as do I, this kind of breaking point where we sort of, we're at sort of a plateau and began to plummet. And he sees it not just with social media in general, but with the innovation of things like and share buttons, which seem totally innocuous. Right. I don't think anyone would expect that putting a like button on a post would directly lead to like the collapse of democracy. But but here we are. He actually says, we might have just handed a 4-year-old a loaded weapon, which I think is great. He says social media began to train users to spend more time performing and less time connecting, which I think is completely spot on. And it encouraged dishonesty and mob dynamics as we were sort of setting the stage for this new kind of what he calls viral dynamics.
Well,
it's a critical point.
This relates to something I wrote down earlier, that when we use the word speech, it it leans a little bit to one side for me a lot of times, but that's just in our culture maybe. But two options. One is the monologue, right? To
Mhm.
give a speech. If you're in a high school and say, I got to give a speech, right, for class, that's what that means. Hop in front of the class and talk for a while. So it's a sense of static monologue, and there's not an engagement. And, that's what happens on social media a lot. It feels that
Yes.
way. It takes some effort to feel that there's a real time communication. Sometimes you get that with comments, but like, it's hard,
Yes.
to even with good intentions to feel like there's this, like what you and I are doing right now.
That's right.
And so it probably just doubles down on that, which gets away from speech as something active, relational, adaptive, responsive, organic. Yeah, which is how it is. Just even at different developmental levels, there's something much more organic when it's happening in real time.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right. No, 100% true. This is why we have said multiple times in the show that when we are interacting with each other online, we have to consciously inhabit the same level of sort of mindfulness that we unconsciously do when we are face to face.
That's a good way to say that. Yeah, right.
Because we don't have that, body language. Right? We're responding
Yeah.
to signifiers in a little rectangle on a screen that, especially when there's not a name on it, it's just an anonymous screen name attached to it.
Yeah,
it's so
and even
disembodied.
that's been something that's been changing a little bit. At least I don't know in the communities we're a part of, where there's more and more of emphasis on like use your real name, use your a photo, or otherwise like not doing it.
That's
which I'm
right.
kind of like that. I'm like, I really don't have interest in engaging with a person who's anonymous unless they're doing something really huge in society where the anonymity feels required, like blowing a whistleblower or something.
Well, dude, especially when you have your real name out there, and especially if you do things like this, like go onto camera and share your views, and
Right.
you're putting to some degree
Yeah.
skin in the game.
Yep.
And then when you have people who are just coming at you with anonymous screen names, it's like, I've got all the skin in the game and you've got no skin in the game.
Yeah.
And yet you're
something we
trying to create a
gotta
hostile interaction.
something we're gonna have to get tired of,
Yeah,
like get
it
worse
gets
before it gets
exhausting.
better. So it's like, well, maybe it
Yep.
needs to get worse.
Yep, that's right. Let's see. Height also notices that both the left and the right have been impacted by this, but in slightly different ways. I personally think this is why we've seen so much backslide and regression on both sides of the political aisle towards MAGA and QAnon conspiracy theories on the right, and towards sort of broken woke extremism and essentialism on the left, both of which are a breakdown of, again, these sort of political cultures into its hard amber absolutist forms. And that absolutism actually, ironically, for reasons we'll talk about a little bit later, ironically get reinforced by the postmodern platforms that they're sort of taking place on. Let's see. You feel free to comment.
No, go ahead. Keep going.
Yeah, because I want to get through the bulk of this so that we can get to away from height stuff and onto our stuff. So finally, what can we do about this? Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm skipping one.
Yeah.
I already mentioned Height believes it's going to get worse before it gets better. He actually mentioned Steve Bannon by name here, particularly Bannon's quote that, quote, the best way to deal with media is to flood the zone with shit. This is the fire hose of falsehoods model that, we sort of inherited from the Russian media paradigm. And it's a tactic that is used to keep populations confused, disoriented, and angry. And guess what? It fucking works.
Yeah,
and in fact, we get addicted to those feelings of outrage and anger, and we want more.
Yeah. It's even more effective, with social media. It's like,
exactly. Yep.
You can,
social media spreads it. The funny thing is, it used to require actual human beings to write, to create the shit that we're flooding the zone with. Now it's like there's artificial intelligence that's able to create passing bullshit, right? That like you wouldn't normally know is not coming from a human being. There's now like essay writing AI bots that are now flooding the zone, which is about as dystopian as I can fucking imagine.
Right. Totally.
So now we get to, I think, the really juicy part, which is what do we do about it? And Height has a couple recommendations. I think we're going to have some of our own as well. So his suggestions are, let's see here. We must harden democratic institutions so that they can withstand chronic anger and mistrust. We must reform social media so that it becomes less socially corrosive and better prepare the next generation for democratic citizenship in this new age. So basically, we're talking about strengthening governing institutions, changing or transforming our social media technologies, and transforming our approach to education itself in order to create more resiliency. And this is important, Ryan, because, we're Gen X, and the generation sort of, before us were the boomers, obviously. We should have more capacity to see this for what it is, because we lived in an analog world. Now we live in a digital world. We have memories of what the world was like before we kind of took this slide into total aperspectival madness. Now, I don't think many of us have noticed, because it's sort of one of those boiling the frog problems. You know what I mean? Like you don't notice that you handed the revolver to the 4-year-old child until the trigger was already pulled. And here we are. But the younger generations, this is all they've known. They're born into this aperspectival madness. And that's why I think he's suggesting that we start taking another look at how we're educating our youth, both in terms of like our, academic institutions, but also just in the level of parenting. You and I are going to do a show down the line sometime, Inhabit Your Fatherhood, which I'm looking forward to, where we can talk about some of these issues. But parenting is very different, critical here.
Yeah. It goes back to what you mentioned about what he said. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better, because the interesting thing is, like, these are strategies to fix it. But the thing is like, people have to see that it's bad enough to want to do those things. And like, it keeps looking like that collectively, we're not quite collectively enough of us tired of how it is in order to change it. But the other option would be is that something is created that is so incentivizing, so appealing, that it's hard to resist. So when like Facebook came out and Twitter and things like that, they were just so appealing, and it's just like, oh, gotta do this is going to be fun. It's offering me something that's impossible otherwise. And I don't know what that is. I mean, I know that more and more, especially in this last year and recent months, DAOs have been coming up big time. I mean, just all over the place. And so it's like, who knows, maybe there's going to be structures and forms that emerge from some of the people who are seeing these things and want to create something that will be so appealing that people can't resist, but until that point, it looks like we have more to go downward in terms of getting tired of it. So that way we can say, let's reform social media. But right now it's like, how many people actually want to reform social media?
That's
people like, nah, I like it just how it is.
Yeah. We're more addicted to being outraged by each other.
Yeah.
Right. Than we are being outraged by the fact that we're always outraged by each other.
Because that's what
it's going to take. It's going to take that meta outrage of like, I'm sick of being tired. I'm sick of being exhausted by all of this. And I can now see it more systemically. It's not that you are the problem, right? Or that group is the problem. It's like, this whole dynamic is fucked from the get-go, and we have to do something to pull ourselves to another level.
Yeah. And I mean, these suggestions sound really great. So I'm just hoping we keep going.
It's another reason why I love this article, Ryan, is like, he's again, reflecting shit that we've been talking about in shows like this forever. I mean, it was, I don't even know how many shows ago where I was talking about,
Corey's
3 ideas.
No, they were great.
Right. And one of those was, we need to make a shift from first past the post voting, which creates a lot of this division in the first place, right? To something like ranked choice voting, which Jonathan Haidt names as one of the, possibly most effective solutions, at least in terms of restoring our governing institutions. I don't think it's an accident. That the only 2 GOP senators who voted for Justice Jackson both came from ranked choice states.
I wasn't really quite aware that there were some ranked choice states.
I know Maine is. Maine is a
awesome.
ranked choice, and I think Alaska.
Cool.
Yeah,
it's encouraging to know that there's at least a few examples out there.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
He's also got a few suggestions to reform social media itself, which we were just talking about, things like user verification. Even if people still want to use anonymous screen names, at least find a way to confirm that it's a human being and not
These are the things that have been coming up big time. I mean, that's been happening more over the last like 3 or 4 or 5 years, where again, the fringes, but you're seeing that like where people identify like verifying my identity through this service, through this other third party service. Like, I want you to know that this is actually me. And like, I'll provides things of like, if somebody else tries to impersonate you, but like, it's just like, you're seeing those things come up, it's not really user friendly and not like people are going to adopt it universally, but they're starting to, the seeds are there. So it's got to be part of a platform that people love. So like if Twitter just decided like, hey, we're going to enforce this, well then boom, that would be huge.
Yep.
But
no, that's
just waiting. That's a random thing. We don't know if someone like Twitter is ever going to do that.
It's an important point because it helps remind us, I think, as integralists, it helps remind us that there's more to this than like, oh, let's just create a whole bunch of new sort of integral structures up here.
Yeah.
Right. What structures that maybe we as integrals absolutely love, we see the value of, blah, 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 blah. But if those structures do not create immediate benefit for really all stages of development leading up to an integral, it doesn't get selected for. You've basically wasted your time creating structures that cannot measurably impact people's lives in a positive way.
Yep.
And so it just sort of remains vaporware. Right. Yeah, I think the challenge here is to think of integral solutions that can downsample. And again, as you're saying, create that immediate, like, oh, this is obviously better.
And that's why, like, the downsampling and immediate benefit to all developmental levels. This is why I go like in a Maslow's hierarchy kind of thing, going down levels of needs, Yeah. So this is why for me, like economic solutions are, to me, it's an obvious one. It's just like benefit the poor and the middle class universally. It's going to be a hard thing for people to resist if it's a true benefit, even if they're just like, I want to get on board. It's just like you make the benefits so big and relevant that they can't refuse it. But if it's a benefit that's only clearly beneficial to, say, an integral level, it's like, well, only integral people are going to want to do it. Or only if it's green, it's only green. It's got to like, how do we get it all the way down, or down far enough that you tip it over into majority? And that 52% really isn't a majority in this country. So you got to click up to 60 plus,
Yep. Well, one of the things that gives me hope, it's a double, I feel like it's a double-edged sword, but is the fact that we have seen in young people, the levels of anxiety, depression, and even suicide are higher now than I believe since we've been sort of tracking the data. And they have been spiking alongside social media adoption, right? So one of Jonathan Haidt's suggestions here is, guys, don't give your kids social media until they're out of puberty. Like these days, 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds are getting exposed to this stuff. He says, wait till they're 16. Wait until their brains are at least somewhat formed enough to be able to handle the enormous sort of, conforming pressures that come with social media. That itself is going to help create more resiliency. I'm hoping that these generations are going to get tired of their own fucking anxiety, right? And then that pushes them to do something about it, to get into their own paths of growing up and waking up, and particularly cleaning up. And unfortunately, that cleaning up for these generations is going to include a lot of shadows that they themselves didn't generate, but were sort of imposed on them from Xers and boomers who created these technologies to begin with. But I'm hoping that anxiety creates just this pressure, this cultural pressure, where people just eventually say, this isn't how we should be living our lives, right? Yeah. There's a better way. There's a better path here, and we just have to co-create it together. Yep. That's my hope.
Just thinking, remember when we were kids, where the biggest thing parents had to worry about with respect to media was, don't sit too close to the TV. Right. That was the extent of just, at least if you're gonna watch TV, step back and you're done. We have to do the complexity of, don't be on Instagram and whatever hell else is new that kids are using and not using. I can't keep track of. I'm done signing up for new social media platforms unless it's truly revolutionary.
There's the old joke of our parents saying, like, don't believe everything you hear on TV, and then immediately believing everything they see on the internet.
Yes, that's really funny.
So these are the types of remedies and interventions that Jonathan Haidt is suggesting.
Yeah.
I would say the only thing that's lacking in this article is interventions. These are all interventions for systems, for cultures, for even small communities and groupings like, family, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But I think one of the things that we've been kind of interjecting throughout this conversation, even, for the last almost hour that we've been having it,
Yeah.
is there's also necessary interventions for the eye, for the upper left quadrant, things that we can do with and within our own consciousness right now in order to, again, create enfoldment mechanisms. This is actually interesting. So I've been using the term enfoldment mechanisms to talk about the total loss of curation in our media, right? It used to be we had like Walter Cronkite's type media personalities who would say, this is more true than that.
Right.
Here's what to pay attention to.
Right.
If it doesn't make it to air, you don't have to pay attention to it. And it was sort of a way of creating a stack of partial truths into something that resembles a greater truth.
Right.
He uses the same, very, very similar terminology here. Let me find this real quick. Yeah, so what I've been calling enfoldment mechanisms, Haidt called mechanisms, and he's talking about in governing right here, mechanisms to slow things down, cool passions, require compromise, and give leaders some insulation from the mania of the moment while still holding them accountable to the people. Okay, so that obviously applied. That's an enfoldment mechanism that was actually built into the Constitution itself, largely because of people like, Madison, who saw this stuff kind of coming, right? This was built into the Constitution itself. I think the point I'm trying to make is we can take that out of the exteriors, out of the systems, and install that into our own personal operating systems. We need our own enfoldment mechanisms right here in our heads and in our hearts to help us navigate the aperspectival madness that our world has just sort of become. And I think that this is where two critical concepts start to come in. One is the Buddhist notion of right speech. I'm going to let you riff on as sort of the resident Buddhist geek.
Yeah.
And then the Quaker ideal of let your next words come from your highest self, which is often the framing that Ken Wilber has talked about when it comes to how do we create more productive, more harmonious, more integral communities. He always suggests that as sort of the primary micro practice, that every sentence we type is coming from our highest self, which it feels to me like a really, really critical invitation.
Yeah. And what I'd advise, like on a practical level, this is just my own intuition working with people, one-on-one in groups. And I bias towards that. So the skillful means, so this is not criticizing any other language. It's just like, oh, well, what will work the most? And sometimes it's different for every person. Right. But we call the show inhabit. And this is the best word that I've come across to point to a sense of embodiment, but it's not about perfection, because when it comes to embodiment, there's no really thing as perfection unless we go to the waking up level. But other than that, everything is just happening all at once, and there's evolving and shadows and everything like that. So there's never a completion and we're done. Maybe there is some final point. We're nowhere near that. Doesn't seem like right now. So like coming from my highest self, a lot of times it practically speaking, it puts a person into some idealizing state that they're trying to search for it or construct something. But I would just offer like, become present as much as you can, as I can, like right here, and let my speech arise from my being. And it is what it is. Right. And then when it happens, I'll see what was useful and what could be better or what's missing, or it could be any number of things. But like, even from a creative standpoint, just like, hey, there's probably maybe what I say just works great that time. Okay. But another time, well, there's something missing. So like that would be what I would say is like continue the inhabiting process, which includes cleaning up, growing up, showing up, waking up. Yeah.
I love that. I love
Yeah,
that.
and that's the best we have, and it brings in like genuine depth, as much depth as we have in this moment. It will bring it forward,
Yep.
and there's humility, because if
Yes.
we're inhabiting, because if it's like, we can be like highest self is could be like kind of to waking up self, and it's like
Mhm.
perfection, like I am speaking like Samatabhadra, the embodiment of reality. So how could I be wrong? But if it's like, hey, where are all these things? Heaven and earth, the classic meeting of that through
Yep.
us.
We did a
Um,
show many episodes ago. We were talking about the polarity of confident humility.
yeah,
I think that's
exactly.
what bringing both of these two sort
Right.
of practices together, that's what it helps cultivate.
Yeah, totally. Now with the right speech thing, it's interesting in the context of Buddhism. Often, at least Tibetan Buddhist context, we considered a little bit more of like a first turning kind of approach, which can involve like, it's not necessarily limited to that. I'm not going to say that, but like often it is. So like right speech, right? We use that thing right. And of course, in the modern context, we might find other translations of that, soften it, make it, try to evolve it. But it's like, it's in a context too, where there are like precepts and things that you should do or you shouldn't do. And so a rule-based kind of thing, which can be really helpful sometimes, right? To like help us find momentum in the right track. But then later, it's got to evolve, and so you go down to like tantric practice later, and it's saying like everything is of use in practice. So
Mhm.
rather than renouncing something, take it and try to transform it, so inhabit it. So if there's anger, inhabit that, and then see how the energy of that anger can be transformed into speech that is more effective, that is more meaningful, that doesn't cause harm. So that's the essential of, is like, how do we not cause harm, and how can we support wisdom, reduction of suffering, etc. But it's funny because for me, speech and knowing that it's tied to right speech in Buddhism often evokes a little bit of like the rule-based
Mhm.
approach to speaking.
It's like
Which again,
playing
I don't.
it's like playing music, isn't it? I mean, the precepts are there to help you learn your scales. And
Well,
once
this
you've
is this will
learned
be
your
a
scales, you can freestyle. You can then start playing jazz because you've created these sort of
this would be a
interior
better.
feedback loops.
I think that would be a more integral understanding, because like when these things arose, it was like, no, that's it,
Right.
that's the
Yeah.
deal. It's like, no, renunciation is the deal. And in
Yep.
some context, still in a traditional context, you might find people who say, no, this is it, you got to follow rules, and there's limitations with that. It's more of an amber kind of orientation. But like what you're saying, I think it definitely can have a place. It's like, well, I'm going to consciously use some rules. I do that all the time, like for behavioral changes and things like that. It's like, yeah, just I'm going to implement this until I don't need that anymore, right? And so like, or foundation, practice the scales. So what would that be like, in speech? Well, it could be like, for example, and again, I go to call the show Inhabiting, and so it's like, well, let me slow things down. I'm going to do a formal practice, and I'm going to try to inhabit myself, attune to being, rest in being, and then I'm going to try to speak, even just words out loud to nobody. Can I stay attuned to this while reading a piece of paper? Can I then stay attuned to that while speaking to a good friend? Can I then do that while speaking to somebody who triggers me? Like you can set this up like contained kind of formal practices, and work way up until it's really organic. But the thing is, we can't take ourselves out of the organic environment. We still continue. So this is the thing, is like in Buddhism, you can enter into a renunciative environment where, yeah, it's contained, and all the conditions are geared towards what you want to do. But like out in the world, it's just chaos, right?
Right.
So for me, that's distinguish those different levels and like which way am I working with. And I think they're all really useful. Like formal practice with limitations, vows, constraints can be really, really good. And then like, how do I bridge the gap and practice up this full spectrum
Mm.
in really simple ways?
Oh, that's yeah. No, I love that. And I love that invitation because, it's one of the patterns that I see happening so frequently is, look, we live in a world. We live in a world.
Movie
It's like a
trailer.
movie trailer there. In a
Yeah.
world that is dominated by a perspective of madness. No, we live in a
Yeah.
media world where
Yep.
profits are made by stressing conflicts,
Yep.
right? Right.
Yep.
That's, I
Yep.
mean, our entire media industry, and this seeps into other, sort of industries as well. Our governing, the whole sort of lower right shebang is
Yeah.
sort of fueled these days by stressing conflicts. Now, here's the thing. we see that not just in our media, but we also see it in our culture and how we treat each other. We also see it in our own consciousness, because these things all co-arise, right? If media ends up shaping our consciousness, which ends up shaping how we relate together, which ends up shaping how we behave in the world, which then in turn reshapes, technologically, and sort of how we self-organize as a society. So there's a feedback loop between all of these quadrants and all of these zones at all times. And for me, just practicing the simplicity of something like right speech helps kind of slow those feedback down. And it helps remind us, I think, that by stressing the conflicts in whatever quadrant we find it, we're creating stress and we're creating conflict. And here's the thing: when you create stress, you create more conflict, because stress affects us neurologically, right? Our amygdalas start to flare up. We begin to lose sort of our capacity for reason. We allow passions to get the better of us. What ends up happening is we reconsolidate to a previous stage that's a little bit more stable than sort of the later stage that we're trying to inhabit, because that's what stress does to it. You put a drop of cortisol into a bloodstream, and all of a sudden the gap between our interpersonal stage and our intrapersonal stage just opens right up, because we are no longer capable of speaking from our highest selves, however we want to conceive that. We are literally, our brain chemistry will not allow it when we are hyper stressed out, especially when we're stressed out for long periods of time.
And speaking of all that, you bring up, upper right quadrant there, which is a funny thing, which can be easily missed by spiritual communities and philosophical communities, that like our biology is really important. So we can talk about like how do still stress and conflict affect our biology, but we also can do things physically, biologically, to help change our state. I mean, this is what happens when we take a psychedelic, except that's really, really intense. But like, exercise and diet, all kinds of things in very simple way. Everybody get caught up in like their special. I used to say, being in Boulder, that diet nutrition, it was the new religion. Like how people feel about it. But these are things not to leave out. I mean, they can affect speech.
Yes,
it's like So if you got a lot of cortisol in your system, it's going to affect it. Now I got to do Mark Rubio.
That wasn't nearly awkward enough.
Yeah, I know. I need to feel more pressure.
Well, and to me, the other thing too, Ryan, is that it's a reminder. The reason why I love that Buddhist frame is that it's a reminder that our words are not inert. Yeah. Right. Our words have impact, often in ways that we will never see or understand. Right. But every word we speak, either verbally or even just in our own minds, ricochet and ripple out and influence future expressions, again, either verbal or in our own minds.
Right.
It's sort of everything we say, everything that we try to communicate and how we try to communicate it sort of formats the hard drive in a slightly different way. Yeah. Right. And when we allow ourselves to, for example, participate in hateful speech, whether we're just thinking it to ourselves or we actually allow it to erupt at each other, right? That actually creates conditions that make more hateful speech more likely in the future, as we begin to sort of associate that coping mechanism with these literal, chemical states in our own brain. This is just what I do when I get pissed off. And it's hard to track the damage that we actually inflict when we do this unconsciously. That doesn't mean that there's no room for anger or even rage or righteous indignation. All of this can be expressed within sort of the construct of right speech. It's about being able to consciously manage it, right? And to not slip into this unconscious repeating of patterns and behaviors that only end up hurting other people as well as ourselves.
Corey, you just gave a great little Dharma talk on right speech. Ooh. I think that was good. you nailed it to me. So that's the whole deal, is like the slowing down, how these things become unconscious. And this is why you apply something like right speech, is to slow it down and become aware of it and aware of the impact and you said it all great, and you can use formal terms like karma, and
Yes.
cyclical existence. That's what it means there in a very simple way. It's like this continues and continues and continues. With that being a foundation, then we can, if we work with that enough to slow it down, to say like, okay, this is happening, and I'm no longer ensnared completely unconsciously, like 24/7. I can see like the three passions in Buddhism, like functioning. Okay, then we can work with it more. We can work with it more transformative ways, even to the point of like, from a waking up perspective, wrathful deities, which, if we're talking about anger, it's like the wrathful deities are completely wrathful. They are like drinking blood from a skull, and they got like weapons and standing on corpses and all kinds of things. So they're not fucking around, So there's an intense energy there, but it is a liberated energy. So it's not like, oh, we're just calling ourselves enlightened and being pissed off. But slowing down, like in practice, and working with speech directly, in some way, communication. I think that's really, really useful. I just go back to the practice I mentioned, some form of that. It's like, okay, whatever state a person may be cultivating, whatever quality we may be cultivating, it's like, okay, can we inhabit that, whatever we consider good? And then what is it like to speak from that place?
Right.
And notice, and don't expect to be perfect, just be curious. And I think for me, like in Tantric Buddhism, there's a deep sense of curiosity. And if you go even further, like Sogyal Mahamudra, like everything is arising on its own accord and liberated automatically, needs nothing. Well, then reality is inherently creative and inherently curious. So I can kind of like let go and see what patterns are habitually arising, with a little bit more laughter, even if it's also painful, and then say, okay, let's work with this because it matters, and that's, to me, integral takes us is like what the fourth turning of Buddhism, like Ken will talk about. We can say like, okay, we're not just going to stop at waking up, even through three turnings, and say like, what's happening here matters. So let's work with speech, in an integral way that can consider and conceive of developmental levels and stages.
Yeah.
Because without that, it's like, gosh, what are we going to do with right speech?
Right.
How do I, even if I am doing great in a therapeutic way, like if I can't acknowledge developmental stages, how good is speech going to be in today's culture wars?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Like, I don't know.
Yeah, because a big part of right speech is also going to be skillful communication, right? It's not just this sort of idealized, everything I say has to be God's self and all that.
And right. And speaking of that, and bringing us back full circle to like when we were talking about how it's great to see organic expression of integral thinking without it even being tied in any way. It doesn't mean that's bad to be tied. It's just like really encouraging to see different forms. And I've been noticing slowly where I know we've talked about different, like films and television, things like that. And we can go back to a movie like The Matrix, and Ken was the commentator along with Cornel West.
Yep.
But seeing it show up even more in like, not like the blockbuster, like that we're still talking about that movie, decades later kind of thing, like just normal random shows and things like that. Well, there's another one. I don't know if you've seen it, but Vince and I've been talking about it on, say, HBO, Minx. First of all, I don't even care about this conversation. I love it. It's freaking hilarious. But to me, it's the first time again where I go, wow, this is kind of organically integral, because I don't think anybody.
Oh, wow.
I don't hear anybody using integral language. I don't have any sense that somebody like, oh, I read this book. But it deals with feminism in particular, and it clearly embraces the evolution of feminism, and like brings up really key points. So it's not just washing away, but then also criticizes an immature form of that, but doing it all from an integral level. And you got to watch it, Corey, because I think when you watch it, you'll want to like maybe make commentary and bring it into one of our shows at some point. But for me, it's just another example. So we talk about integral speech, integral communication. It happens through art. It happens through music. It happens through movies. It happens through critical journalism. But to me, like, it makes me stop. I just think about like, wow, they did that in a way where this show is just enjoyable. And it just happens to be because we're integral nerds, that I have that thought and go like, wow. And like literally one of the lines, which out of context is like, well, who cares? But it was in response to a really intense, like growing up moment. And one of the person says, because grow the fuck up. That's why. But like in the context of this whole show, it feels like the integral growing up. Like this is what we mean, but it happens in all a really funny way. It's really well cast. It had to be done just how it is done, because otherwise I think a lot of people might have railed against it in some way, but really good. So I wanted to throw it out there.
And repeat the title one more time.
Minx, Minx. Super, super funny. Definitely rated R. So it's a comedy, but well done. And anybody who's watching this show, I think like if you watch it, it's going to be very hard to not just think integral light bulbs, going off in addressing it addresses an issue, but does it in an entertaining way. So for me, this is a sign, because it's not heavy handed in the sense of like, we're going to be integral. It's like, it just is. And so like, the more organic we see this, the more encouraged I feel, because I'm like, oh, these forms are popping up on their own.
Totally. No, that is exciting. And again, it just makes you feel like, regardless of where it's coming from, this is all part of this ongoing grand unfolding.
Yep.
And everything is right on time. Everything is right on time. Right. We have all the right problems that are creating the right kinds of pains. And I don't say that in an insensitive way, because there is genuine suffering out there. But we as human beings, particularly as primates, tend not to do anything until we feel pain. That's just how we work. We're freaking chimpanzees with smartphones, right?
Yeah.
We don't do anything. We don't proactively head things off at the pass. We only solve problems once the pain gets too much for us to endure. And I think that is where we are now. And I think in a sense, this can allow us to even readjust our relationship with pain and suffering. Like these things, it's not meaningless. It feels meaningless when you are in the midst of despair, but it's all turning into rocket fuel somehow, hopefully for you. But if not for you, almost certainly for others. And I'm hoping that we're reaching this tipping point of fear, anxiety, pain, alienation, disconnection, loneliness, that all culminates into suicide, right? I'm hoping this pain is enough to sort of erupt into a new, just more better expectations for how we should be doing this human game together. And I'm glad that we started here talking about, again, right speech and sort of, again, this Quaker idea of let the next words come from your higher self, because this is an enfoldment mechanism that we can install into our own personal operating system right now. Like you watching this at home right now, you can make a commitment. You can say, you know what? Yes, I am going to begin a right speech practice, and I'm going to try to, wrap some mindfulness around that, so that when I'm communicating to anyone on the internet or talking to my mom on the phone or whatever it might be, I sort of can feel this mechanism doing its work, in my own interiors. And then that brings us, I think, to another stage where, okay, that's sort of what we can do intrapersonally within ourselves. How do we now do this interpersonally? What is an enfoldment mechanism that we can place between us, right? That can kind of keep us a little bit, I don't know, on the right track, or at least keep us in a genuinely communal relationship with each other, where we can actually create shared reality with each other, rather than just kind of completely talking across each other all the time. So this will lead us into the next section. Unless you have any comments you'd like to.
I was going to start talking about that, but go ahead.
So I did this interview with Stefan Schultz from Spiegel magazine. I published it a couple weeks ago on Integral Life, and it was an awesome, really, really awesome discussion. I highly suggest people check it out. And one of the things that we talked about were he included in his presentation some different strategies that he sees at each stage of media, which he calls their conference culture. And I listened and I saw his presentation, and it's just been sort of sticking with me. And I've been finding myself thinking about it a lot, and actually seeing these dynamics playing out in all of these different communities that all of us are a part of. Right. And so he actually goes through and he outlines, and what I'll do is I'll just read sort of a summary of these at each stage, and then we can kind of talk about them all together. So at the amber stage, This is sort of a top-down communication style. This is just basically pure talking points. Perspectives are handed down through a perceived media or institutional authority, and then repeated, usually uncritically, by adherents to that ideology, whatever it might be, right? We see this a lot.
Mhm.
Early orange. So one of the things Stefan does is he doesn't just say amber, orange, green. He breaks orange into two stages, which reflects like Suzanne Cook-Reuter's work, for example, where we've got early orange, which we sometimes call umber, which is the expert stage, and then late orange, mature orange, which is the achiever stage. So at the early orange expert stage, this is debate culture, where the goal is always to compare the most idealized version of your own perspective, which is often established via amber top-down communication, comparing that to the most negative straw man depiction of the other's perspective. Here, we see critical thinking as primarily meaning I need to be critical of everyone else's point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And the goal here is oftentimes to basically walk away feeling like the smartest person in the room. You want to feel like the expert, right? And then at the late orange stage, this is more like dialogue culture. So we go from debate to dialogue. And the point here is not necessarily to win a conversation, though that can take place as well. We do call this the achiever stage, after all. But it's actually more about learning more about each other's views and values. These dialogues can certainly take the form of debate when they need to, but not the bad faith kind of debate that we see at early orange, which likes to make characters and straw men out of opposing views. Instead, here, there's more emphasis not on straw manning each other, but steel manning each other. In other words, I need to give the most accurate summary of your point of view as I can before I try to criticize it, right? Rather than criticizing an exaggerated caricature of your argument that I have in my own head. Here we see critical thinking means not just I need to be critical of everyone else's point of view, but most importantly, I need to be critical of my own point of view. And this is, I think, something that comes online in a big way at that late orange stage. This brings us to green, where we go from, again, debate at early orange, dialogue at late orange, to something like discourse culture at green. Here, the dialogue is opened up to far more perspectives, which can produce a far more robust conversation with a pluralism of informative perspectives across a very wide spectrum of thought. I think we should know that at this stage, oftentimes alternative perspectives are actively prioritized over more mainstream or orthodox or dominant perspectives. It often lacks a way to navigate all of these accumulated perspectives or to recognize which of them might be more relevant, more germane, more legitimate than others. Again, this points to the lack of an enfoldment mechanism, which we've been talking about throughout this show and certainly throughout other shows as well. This is the stage that most of our social media platforms currently run on. It's discourse culture. However, that discourse, that total body of discourse, can be coming from any of these stages. So there's a lot of debate. There's a lot of early orange expert level debate happening in discourse culture. There's a lot of dialogue happening in discourse culture. And of course, there's genuine discourse taking place in discourse culture. I think the point here is that if you are at one of the earlier stage, you cannot inhabit the tactics and the strategies of the higher stages. But if you're at a higher stage, you can enact the strategies of the lower stages as appropriate, right? And then we get to the teal stage. I like to call this enfoldment culture. So again, we go from sort of top-down communication to debate culture, to dialogue culture, to discourse culture, to enfoldment culture. This is where participants have done the inner work to dislodge their identity from their political or ideological views, allowing them to have more robust conversations, to rethink or enhance their own positions, and to distinguish partial truths from less than partial truths, whether in themselves or in other people around them. You can still be passionately invested in a discussion or a set of ideas, but there's much less grasping, since that passion is just another subject that we can easily turn into object. It has much more capacity to fold together seemingly irreconcilable truths, often by using methods like polarity management, integral truth claims and stage specific interpretations of truth, which is exactly what I'm trying to do in this presentation, is showing stage specific interpretations of how just to relate with each other. Now, I myself see, when I look at the integral community, I see all of this. I see a lot of people coming in with sort of a debate mentality, right? I'm going to look at, for example, I've been talking here for probably 5 minutes now. Someone might come in, if they're coming from the debate culture, find the one thing they can disagree with, and then discard the 98% of everything else I said. You're going to see much less of that at a dialogue level, and far less of it at a genuine discourse level. And then, of course, at an unfoldment level, we do a much better job of actually identifying and integrating each other's truths, as partial as they may be. We want to build on each other's arguments, not sort of cut each other down, right? We want to plus each other. We don't want to subtract from each other for our own personal gain or social credit or what have you. So I see these as another unfoldment mechanism, just simply noticing these different stages, right, of intersubjective, interpersonal contact that we have with each other can help us call ourselves out when we feel like we're really only engaging in, maybe one of these levels. It can be a reminder to like, oh, okay, I am doing a little bit of grasping here. Or like, oh, my emotions are kind of flared up right now. How can I turn my sort of desire to debate? Let's bring it up one tick. Let's bring it out of debate and into dialogue, right? It just becomes another set of guardrails that we can hopefully consciously use in order to have just better, more skillful enactments of each other, not just the conversations between us, but like, so that I can better inhabit your point of view, you can better inhabit my point of view. And guess what? Boom, we just created a shared reality that didn't exist a few moments ago before we decided to do that.
That's great. That's great. And just looking at all these options here for the different levels, I think too, just like we say with every developmental level, you can transcend and include those. So like we may evolve, based on shadow work and things like that, but also we can have a little bit more fluidity in choosing when to engage one of these, because sometimes maybe one is more appropriate than other, right? Depending on the context and circumstance. So that's the other thing, is like, one is just seeing those developmental levels and honoring, say, like, okay, this person is at this, orange level, of debate, and that's where they're at. So it's like, well, I got to figure out how to skillfully interact with them. Or it's like, oh, I've devolved to that debate thing. How do I free myself up to not be limited to that? Or it's like, hey, actually, maybe a debate approach would be the best thing in this moment for whatever particular reason. And I think that's really interesting coming online there. I think strategically, like it's a theory of like an obvious that this is possible, but seeing it actually happen in the world, this is what's going to unfold. Is like seeing how that actually takes place, of like knowing when to deploy which strategy at what moment, what context.
That's the key right there. That's the key, because each one does transcend and include the other, which is why I said, if you're at the higher stages, you're still capable of the strategies that come with the earlier stages. If you're at an earlier stage, you are not capable of the strategies coming from higher stages. Now, this is important, I think, because sometimes when we like to imagine integral unfolding, we imagine it as this like purely kind of bottom up, like we need to get to the next level and then get to the next level and push everything up as much as we possibly can. But the opposite is equally true. Like, for example, when we shift from green to teal, when we take that momentous leap from first tier to second tier, it's not just a reaching up. It's also a reaching down. It's a befriending of all the prior stages of development in ourselves, not just in the world around us, but also within ourselves, that we have most likely made an enemy out of. Right. So there's this simultaneous, it's not just a reaching up to teal. It's sort of a full spectrum embrace of all the stages and all the wisdoms, the unique wisdoms that emerge from each of these stages,
Yeah.
and then knowing how to use that to navigate. I mean, as you say, Ryan, if you're coming from purely, you're kind of emotionally flared up, you're making caricatures out of my arguments, and you're comparing the best of your argument to the worst of mine, you're in that early orange kind of debate, right? I can sit here, if I'm green, if I just discourse all day, no shared reality is actually created. I'm taking the wrong strategy to, for this relationship that's in front of me at this moment right now.
Right.
So what I might do instead is say, I'm going to try to take more of a dialogue. I'm going to try to, I'm going to take a half step above where I see you coming from, right? So that hopefully we can up level this whole sort of dynamic between us.
Right.
That's where I think these kinds of maps become
useful. It's really useful.
First, just to notice, but then to actually select an appropriate strategy.
Yeah, this is great. I think that's where the work is at. There's a good part 1, part 2 of like, looking at like how do we work with individually, like with whatever is going on for us. But then it's like, okay, what does this look like in culture, and in groups?
Yep.
Society.
Well, and the other point I want to make about this, just because I find it interesting, is I often caution people against the temptation to make an object out of other people's subjects, right? To do this like "you're so green" crap that we see often with like really immature expressions of integral.
Yep.
It's kind of like, I've got this new color by number kind of model, and I'm just going to squeeze everything however I can. Reality is way more complicated than that. First off. Second off, you don't actually have any access to someone's interior unless you're in an intimate relationship with them. So the thought that you can sort of glean their cosmic address through sort of the little thin layer of the iceberg that's poking above the surface that we actually have access to, especially on the internet, right? Which is the smallest tip of the iceberg you can actually imagine. I think it's a fool's errand to think that we can actually assess each other in that way. And that's why I always resist this kind of reconstruction of each other's interiors. And, clearly you're coming from amber right now. And, I'm coming from integral and all that shit. It's abusive. It's rude is really what it comes down to. It's a rude thing to do. However, got a caveat on that, because I think when we're looking at these different strategies of engaging with each other, all of these are products of the interpersonal line. And the interpersonal line is by nature intersubjective. And the word intersubjective means you need at least two subjects, right? There's a contact that's taking place between two subjects. And I think that when it comes to the intersubjective line, we can get a fairly, not a sense of who you are totally at all times of your life, like what's your stage of interpersonal growth. I can't get that, but I do get a good taste of like, what is it right now at this moment, right? I can get a good taste of your subject because it's enmeshed with my subject right now as we're having this conversation. But that's important. I think the thing that's important to remember there is oftentimes, again, especially in periods of stress, our interpersonal line consolidates far below our intrapersonal line. So we might ordinarily have a center of gravity that's like, let's say, green to teal. But if we're really stressed out, we're going to descend. We're going to sort of find a resting place at an earlier stage that just feels more stable to us in that moment. And that's where our interpersonal line can sometimes sort of, that can determine how we use our interpersonal line to communicate. So it's not that like this gives us a magic window into each other's souls, but it does tell us something about how we're relating to each other right now, which I think allows us to kind of like, hey, I feel like you're kind of making a caricature out of me. I feel like you're kind of straw manning me a little bit. Let's do a little bit better and see if we can raise the discourse.
Yeah.
And that feels valuable.
Definitely. Yeah. And, going back to the practical suggestions from earlier of like, look at what context, because even saying like how messy it all is really like, and talking about how you're saying very difficult to make an object in a nice, neat way, that it's often based on context. So it could be like, oh, with good friends who we really love, no, we cruise at the higher altitude, a more particular challenging relationship or a particular challenging a group we find challenging, well, then we might devolve. So it's like where and when and where do we get stressed, and identify those circumstances, and then identify what actually happens in experience. That's the real thing. And I think like the more that we do that, the less likely we were going to paint somebody into like a simple box, because it's like, well, if I feel in constantly to how much shifts moment to moment in my own experience, and in better and worse ways, it's like, okay, well, that doesn't mean not like you said, not to like acknowledge and act on that, because to not do that would be like, I don't know, like idiot compassion or something like that, right? It's just sort of like, or lack wisdom. But it's like, no, okay. But one bias there in terms of right speech, in terms of a formal practice, could be like, well, let me bias towards honoring where that person is coming from, and let me have that be my orientation. If I want to make an object, out of their subject, and then if that gets a really positive response, well, then it kind of confirms it. If it doesn't get a positive response and it's kind of like, wait, what are you talking about? Well, then maybe you're off.
No, that's I'd say that's actually one of the more important points that we've made in this talk, Ryan, because it really is all context based. We are different people in different contexts, right? It's not like, oh, I'm Teal, and therefore everything I say is always Teal
24/7.
or you know what I mean? Or like even that like 50% of the things that I say and do are going to be Teal. It's all context dependent. If I'm playing a video game and I'm shooting people in the face, I'm not very Teal in that moment. I'm like, fuck you, I'm going to annihilate. You know what I mean? And totally. That's okay. There's enough space that's the beautiful thing, is that there's enough space of consciousness to inhabit all
actually,
of
that's good. That practice that you just said there is, I think that's actually something that's healthy to do, and integral, is like to feel that out. Like totally. go play a video game where you, like we did the game episode, but it's like, we'll play a game where you have to be a team, and it's all about you having your team colors and your team banner, your whatever tribe, and like flex that muscle and see like, hey, guess what? It feels good because it is part of who we are, That's
right. And that's what Teal helps loosen, is that that either addiction or in most cases an allergy to these lower stages and drives and impulses within ourselves, when it's like, no, man, that's your anatomy. That's
find healthy ways that feel good, whether it's watching sports or watch Olympics or who knows, whatever it is. Just find the amber thing, and then find the orange bit, and find.
There was a YouTube comment on one of some other video that we posted on here. I can't remember who it was from, but they were recalling Ken Wilber himself saying something like, most days I spend most of my time at beige. And it's kind of like a funny throwaway, like self-deprecating thing, but it's also like, no, we eat and we shit. It's not like I'm eating turquoisely right now. It's like,
you know what I mean? It sounds like a good book. Eating turquoisely.
That's right. But the idea being like, it's all context bound. And this is, I think, a criticism that a lot of even sort of integral scholars have at the integral framework as it's commonly held. It's held as this like totally categorical thing. And once you are something, you're at that thing, and that's who you are. When it's like, it's so like, man, hanging out with you and Vince, for example, I feel a different bandwidth of permissions to be more of myself than if I was hanging out with like my old college friends or something like that. That bandwidth is going to be more narrow. It's probably going to be a little bit lower down in my system. And that's okay too. I can inhabit that. I will be that person in that context. And hopefully when I show up to do a show like this with you, I can be a different person in this context.
Yeah. It's funny to in context. So like with taking private swim classes at the Y, so I can feel better about that. And now using the triathlon to like my motivation. But I'm not like, obsessed with it. Like I might be at a very different mental level, but I'm like full on in it. I'm like, hell yeah. Like I'm getting really into it. And talking to my swim coach is funny. He's I don't know where he's at, but didn't strike me as like an integral person, but I really like him in that context. It's like, that's what I want my swim coach to be, is like achievement oriented, focused, practical, that kind of thing. And I remember telling him one day that like, one thing I got going for me, even though there's a lot of things that I really suck at with swimming, is meditation and embodiment practice. And I said something to that effect to him, and it was kind of just like all right, just like let's not talk about that.
Yeah.
Like he's not interested. He does not where he's coming from. That's totally fine. I'm not going to be like, hey, we got to really get into this thing. It's like, no, I enjoyed hanging out with him for the swim lessons, and I appreciate his help, but it's different context. So I'm going to talk about different things with different people. And it's nice to be able to be fluid like that.
Yeah.
And it just feels better.
Yeah. And that fluidity, I think, is one of the real gifts of Integral, because again, it's been explicated for ourselves. It's like, no, you need to, here's all the different dimensions of you, right? Here's all the sort of stratifications and strategies that come out of the stratifications, and all of that. Here's everything that you are, and you now have the capacity and the freedom and the permission to be all of it as appropriate from context to context. Tremendously liberating.
It's probably like, now coming down to it, I think I might adopt it as like a growing up practices to recommend to people, is to find really enjoyable ways, in whatever form it is that's not harmful to others or yourself, of like, go find ways to express that kind of level for yourself. So like in Amber, if it's like being a team, and like whatever, okay, go do that, like find something where you really enjoy it, so you can feel the goodness in that level for yourself, and see what happens,
Yep.
Because then it'll be a little easier to like deal with the parts that aren't so good,
that's right,
that need the guardrails.
That's right. That's why we oftentimes get questions in Integral communities about things like, hey, I'm just beginning to learn about Integral, and the map is telling me that I have certain beliefs or proclivities that maybe are a little bit more magical, right? Might be a little bit more magenta. How do I get rid of those so that I can be more integral? And my whole thing is always like, why do you feel like you need to get rid of them?
Yeah.
I mean, you know what I mean? Like, if you're a baseball player and you really think that like this little totem, whatever it might be, this sock that you wear, whatever it might be, if you really feel like that little superstition is giving you that much extra edge, I mean, first off, placebo is a hell of a drug.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, totally.
One of the most effective drugs out there. So even if we want to take that rational view of it, it really doesn't matter. Like, let some of that magic into your life. Don't feel like
let it like be. Yeah, let it be like that, because it'd be too quickly to like slap the placebo label on it, which doesn't let you just enjoy the magic of it. But of course, a lot of times with that, I automatically go hang out with your kids or some kid, because and enter into their magic world. And then it's inevitable. You're just going to like find yourself letting go into magenta, and you don't have to think about it and analyze it and be like, well, this isn't real. It's like, it doesn't matter. It's like, you just go with the magic of it.
Yep. That's why I still love watching fantasy movies. This is why
movies are a really good way of feeling it. Yeah. Magic. And
I want to get an Integral Dungeons and Dragons crew going, because I feel like we would have the best game of Dungeons and Dragons ever made.
Nice.
That would just be so much fun. But these are ways to kind of recontact some of these early, and the same is true of Red, right?
Go back to the movie episode.
Exactly.
That's a good way to just like enjoy it. Like, don't analyze it, etc. You just like enjoy it. Like, I love some Harry Potter movies. It's just like, give me the magic.
Yep. Perfect example. You can watch a Harry Potter music and get totally absorbed in that like imaginal world, that very, very magenta to red world, right?
Yeah.
Without having to also carry in your green concerns about the author's transphobia, or you know what I mean? Like, whereas like if you're at green, chances are you can't separate those very well. The artifact and the artist are just kind of fused together. It's like, well, no, give yourself permission to let some of that shit go. Just let it go.
The both and thing, right?
Yep. Hey, I still listen to, there's something, probably a topic for a future episode, Ryan, but the sort of when an artist does something bad, and how that, or if that changes our perception of the artwork. Like, I noticed, like, I can't watch Kevin Spacey movies because I can't separate the persona from the person, right?
Yeah.
However, I will still turn the volume up if a Michael Jackson song comes on.
Well, it might be, I'm the same.
There's more distance.
There's more distance, but also too, it might be just how significant the work is. Like Michael Jackson, to me, I mean, it's just by many people's standards, it's just like, well, no, I mean, like how historical and revolutionary like somebody was in their work. Like Michael Jackson, I mean, you can go from objective analysis and just be like, changed music, changed pop music, and the level of craftsmanship was just bananas. So it's like, yeah. And Kevin Spacey, yeah, like he's not like he wasn't a chump actor, but like if it were Tom Hanks, for example, in terms of the body of work Tom Hanks is producing, tomorrow comes out Tom Hanks is somehow some really bad guy.
QAnon already believes he is
I know, I remember the
pedophile,
QAnon thing.
So
yeah, so I think there's sometimes that happens, and it has to do with the profundity of the artwork, which of course we label as, it's always purely subjective, but we can have some objective markers. But it is an interesting thing.
It's a fun tangent to go down, and again, it's something we should pick up another one. But I often use the example of I think stand-up comics actually get the brunt of this, where like it's probably hardest to separate the performer from the person when it comes to stand-up comics, because there's an authenticity of comedy, right? There's just something about comedy where it's sitting right on our zone 4 line of like what's permissible to say or not say, which is how this fits into our habit your speech. There's permissions. So Bill Cosby, for example, his early shit is no longer funny to me. I can't listen to it. And the reason is that comedy itself depends on an image of righteousness and authenticity. This is family-based, healthy Amber in a lot of ways, family-based comedy. Dad is great. He makes us a chocolate cake, that type of shit, which gets completely undermined as soon as you know who the person actually is and what they were capable of when he was telling these jokes. So that to me ruins the comedy. I can't salvage Bill Cosby comedy. However, I still think Louis C.K. is funny.
Yep. Well, different. There's going to be different.
Because we already knew he was a scumbag.
Well, there's different things because and we're definitely going to do that episode on stand-up comics.
Yes.
But that was the thing for me, is like with Louis C.K. was like who he presented himself as, and then what we found out, the gap was very small. Like, to be honest, it's just like, if people are being honest, like if people aren't honest, be like, oh my gosh, it's like you're not being real.
Louis C.K. of all people.
It's like doesn't excuse anything, but it was just like not far off from. It just wasn't a gap where compared to what Bill Cosby presented and who he turned out to be. The gap was enormous. Even the stories outside of it about him calling up other comics and being like, "Why do you like Eddie Murphy? Why do you have to say fuck?" It's just like, oh, you're a dickhead, man. It's like you're having that conversation with what you were doing. So like it changes a lot. But also, and we'll get into that episode too, like in talking about communication and culture, is just like stand-up comics are also a product of our culture. Like they fulfill something for us on our behalf that they're
in the vanguard of our culture.
Like where it's so easy to treat them as individuals and distance ourselves, but it's like, no, they exist because we want them to exist. And we're like, please process all of our collective shadows through humor until you do something and we have to pretend like we don't know you. But I did watch the first time I watched a Louis C.K. clip like 2 nights ago. I just haven't got around to see anything, and I was like, he's really good at his craft. I'm like,
he's a good storyteller.
It's not an excuse anything, but I was just like, he's good. Yep. Anyways, well, we'll save a lot more of that for another episode because there's a lot to talk about. I know.
No, that was a good tease for the future comedy episode that we've been sort of cooking up for a few months now. We just need to, have the time. It's a lot of organization.
Like the video,
like our film clip and video game episodes.
It's gonna take a little bit of work.
Yep. Well, dude, this has been awesome. It's funny. I went to bed last night and I was kind of stressed out for the show. I'm like, I've got this thing about stages of engagement with each other. I don't know what else, how are we gonna float a whole show? And like, I woke up this morning and it was just like, oh shit, we've got like a lot to talk about today.
Boom. Thank goodness for you, Corey.
Hey, you as well, man. This has been awesome. That's why I love doing this with you.
Likewise, man.
Yeah, we have so much fun. And again, this just feels so critical to me at this moment. So again, just to review for people, think about these different kinds of what I'll call again enfoldment mechanisms, simple little practices, injunctions, etc., that we can create in all 4 quadrants, in our technology and social media, as well as in our communities, in our culture, as well as in our behavior, right? And even our mental health, right? Our brain health, our physical health,
Mhm.
and then in our consciousness. What are the kinds of unfoldment mechanisms that we can install into all these different dimensions of our operating system in order to be better, do better, feel more fulfilled, feel more engaged with each other in a truly authentic way, so that we can, again, close the gap between this ideal world that we all want to live in, that's somewhere out there past the horizon, and this sort of fairly dystopian world we find ourselves in today. All of us together, I think, can do the work to bring those two worlds together.
Yeah,
And that's what gets me up in the morning, man.
that's great. Great summary, man. Cool.
Well, Ryan, I love you, buddy. I can't
Love
wait
you too,
to
man.
jump on Destiny with you
It'll
sometime this
happen
week.
at some point.
Let's descend together.
I know, man. I love it. Yeah. Well, good to see you. And
Thank you.
thanks to everybody who was here in the live stream and later watching the replay.
That's right. And we will catch you guys next month. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks. Take
Bye.
care.